Fabulous. Okay, you want to...
My name is Charlotte Gibbs. We are in Los Angeles, California. Today's date is the 18th of March, 2024, and we are interviewing Harry Davids. Okay.
Rolling?
It's rolling. Please introduce yourself.
Harry Davids is my name.
Can you spell your first and last name for me?
Harry. Last name is Davids, Davids.
And what was your name at birth? What was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Harry Leo Davids. An additional name was added to my name by the Nazis after the country of my birth was invaded. The name that was added was the name Israel.
Can you spell that for me, please?
Israel.
And where were you born?
In Amsterdam in the Netherlands.
And how old are you today?
I'm now 81.
And who did you live in Amsterdam with?
I lived with my parents in Amsterdam for the first 2 months of my existence. And then I was picked up by members of the Dutch resistance and taken into hiding at the age of 2 months, separated from my parents, whom I would never see again.
Please tell me about your mother.
I'm sorry?
About your mother.
Well, my mother came from a small town in Germany. Several members of her family were very well known, including one famous German philosopher. I know very little about her. Most of the information that we have about her, we got almost by accident. I have only one photograph of her, and that was taken when she was a young girl of maybe 8 or 9 years old, taken in a portrait studio alongside her brother. She and my brother lived with their parents in this small town in Germany until the 1930s. When the Nazis took over, they began something called Aryanization. What that meant was Aryan Germans, non-Jewish Germans, would take over businesses, homes, and other properties. They would pretend to compensate. The compensation was a fraction of the regular worth. And that's what happened to my parents. They lived in a very fine home. In my binder over here that I have with me, I have a photograph of that home, which I had never seen before. It was actually sent to me by someone completely unknown whose grandparents had once lived there. And when they found out the history of the home, they immediately got rid of it.
And where was this town?
There's a town called Warburg, Warburg.
And what was your mother's name?
Her maiden name was Berg, Berg.
And what was her first name?
Her first name was, well, her actual names were Bertha Lily, but it was common among Jewish people to use the second name as their used name. So Lily was the name she was known by.
And how do you spell that?
Lilly, 2 L's.
And what was your father's name?
His name was Alfred Davids, or Davids in German. And he was born in another small town in Germany, an even smaller town. The town was called Darfeld, Darfeld, which is now part of a larger municipality. This town was one of several towns within Germany that was the site of launching of V-2 missiles from Europe into Britain during the war.
Do you know how your parents met?
We're not sure, but the prevailing thought is that they met at a social gathering. My father's uncle owned a very fine department store in Amsterdam, and he lived in a very fancy house. It became known as Villa Rosa. It was taken over from some other relatives who had passed without leaving children. The house still stands. It's a National Historic Building today. My second cousin still lives in that building, and I have a third cousin who lives on another floor on my mother's side. So there's a long story, a long family history there. And the building is located on a park called Vondel Park, which is one of the nicest parks in Amsterdam. And the building consists of several floors. The lower floor, which is partially submerged, was used for various things. Well, you could almost call it a basement. At the time that my father and mother were living in Amsterdam, had not yet met each other in the 1930s, my great-uncle used that lower level to invite young Jewish people, unattached people, to gather socially. And our understanding is that's where my birth parents met.
When did they meet?
That would have been in the late 1930s, probably before World War II began.
And when did they move from Germany to Holland?
Each one of them moved separately. At that point, they had still not yet met each other. My father, we know, had left in 1932. I have some papers. My mother, we believe, left not earlier than 1933 or 34, which was when the Nazis took over, but not later than 1937. Somewhere between those dates, based on other information we have.
Did they come to the Netherlands with other family members?
Yes. Let's talk about my mother first. She left with her brother at the same time, and the reason was not so much about the Nazis. It was about unemployment in Germany. My mother came from a middle-class, well-to-do family in this little town of Warburg. Her parents, my grandparents, lived in this house, for which I have a photograph, and my grandfather was a partner with his father-in-law in a very fine fashion department store in downtown Warburg, which was unusual for a small country town. This was an area that was mostly agricultural, and these were mostly very prosperous farmers. It was a very fertile area, so they could afford to buy better stuff for their families, and they would come and do their shopping at stores like that run by my grandfather. In the mid-1930s, the Nazis seized the property, the building, and the business. They gave my grandfather and his partner almost nothing for the business, and he was forced, in his 60s and ailing, he was forced to leave town and try and find work elsewhere at a time when there was no work. He and my grandmother moved to a town called Kassel. It's a well-known city in Germany, well-known because that's where the brothers Grimm spent a lot of their time and wrote many of their fairy tales. There's even a street that runs through there known as the Fairy Tale Road. But that's where they went, and it was no fairy tale for them. My mother and her brother were with him at the time. They were both unattached. The house was seized as well, so they were forced to leave anyway. They were there until shortly after the event known as Kristallnacht. In November 9 and November 10, it was actually over 2 nights, when young German youths and also in Austria went on a rampage against Jewish communities, smashing store windows in the business districts, setting fire to many of their properties, officially killing about 91 according to the record. There were probably more, sending off about 25,000 young Jewish German men off to camps such as Buchenwald and Dachau. And the event was so traumatic that those Jews that were still left in Germany, which was still a fair number, all wanted to get out. And my grandparents were no exception. They wanted to leave. That they did only the following year. In February 1939, they moved to the Netherlands and to Amsterdam, and that was where their son and daughter were living at the time. There's a lot more to this, but that's just the basics of what they did. And they did not have any work. So my mother and her brother had to bring in the household income. They lived not far away from each other. My mother lived in one place with the son lived in one place, and my mother in a different place with my grandparents. 1940, Germany invades the Netherlands. Now if any Jews are thinking of getting out of the Netherlands with exceptional circumstances, and that happened in my family, with exceptional circumstances, you couldn't get out. They were stuck. My parents by that time had already married. This was in May 1939, not May 1940, and the Germans had already conquered the Netherlands. It took them only 5 days. The Netherlands were totally unprepared for it. They'd been neutral in World War I. Their armaments were, outdated. Almost no Air Force or Navy. Forces poorly trained. They were just no match for the Germans. So now Germany's in control. There were measures taken against the Jewish population after the occupation began, similar to what had happened in Germany and other countries. Jews were now required to live in certain areas, so they had to register if the Germans knew where to find them. Many of the birth and marriage records were altered to include the names Israel for males and Sarah for females when it wasn't clear whether they were Jewish or not. There were other situations, like if their names were Cohen or some of the Jewish names, those names were sometimes left unchanged. But for the most part, they were changed. Then the original records would be destroyed. When people ask me, do I have a birth certificate, I answer them, I have a birth record. And the birth record is dated sometime, I think, in 1957, if I'm not mistaken, long after. But that's a copy. But when they actually made the change, it was during the occupation in 1942, I believe it was, when they made these changes. And that was shortly after I was born. So they had all these restrictions. If they had bicycles, they had to turn over their bicycles. Bicycles are the number one mode of transportation, and they were then too. So that was a big deal. Later, during the occupation, they would not even be allowed to use public transportation. Jewish teachers were no longer able to teach Aryan Dutch people. And be aware that the Dutch people, that the non-Jewish population, the Gentile population, were considered fellow Aryans by the Nazis. They are Germanic people, and they were considered members of the so-called the master race. So, except in certain circumstances, the Germans did not treat them quite as harshly as they did the people of Poland and other countries whom they considered inferior, the Slavic people and so on. But they had all these restrictions on Jewish people. Jewish children could no longer be taught by Aryan Dutch teachers and so on. I could go on and on, but you're probably familiar with these, and so are most people. So there were these restrictions, but initially no physical harm, except in a number of isolated cases where some young Dutch men decided to get involved in armed resistance activities, which was a no-no. And several hundred of them were sent off to Mauthausen and other places. Most of them would never return. But for the most part, most of the Jewish population was left untouched. And at that time, you could say there were maybe 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands out of a total of something under 9 million. Okay? So those were the stats. All of this changed in the middle of 1942, to be exact, middle of July 1942. This was when the Nazi Germans began to implement the so-called final solution in the Netherlands, going around raiding homes, rounding people up. They had different word descriptions of this. In France, they used to call it la rafle. In the Netherlands, they were known as razzias.
How do you spell that?
R-A-Z-Z-I-A-S. It's pronounced like the Italian way, razzias. And they would then invade certain areas where Jews were known to be living, or where they instructed the Jews to live, such as where we were. And then they would either send them off on trams, buses, trucks to the nearest train stations. From there, most of them were sent to a camp called Westerbork. Westerbork is up in the northeast of the Netherlands, if you don't already have this information. This is where the vast majority of the Jews of the Netherlands were sent. Approximately 107,000 were sent there. The majority of them, 99,000, were sent either to Auschwitz-Birkenau to be gassed to death, or to a smaller gas chamber camp called Sobibor, both in German-occupied Poland. These gas chamber camps that were part of the final solution were all in occupied Poland. They were not in Germany. And that's how this operation worked. Now, my birth mother was in the third trimester of her pregnancy with me when these raids and roundups began in mid-July 1942. She and my father had already met about a year and a half earlier, and they were living in a building which I have a photograph for in my binder, located about 150 yards from the apartment building where Anne Frank and her family used to live before they moved into hiding. Most people don't know about this. It's in a residential district. There's a square there in front of her home with a large statue, larger than the one at the so-called Anne Frank house, which is where the tourists go near downtown. Okay, but there's no evidence that our families knew each other. They were from a different part of Germany anyway. But that was where they were living at the time that these raids and roundups began. I should tell you about my father, because I never mentioned that earlier. He was invited to work in a business owned by his uncle, my great-uncle, who was known as Maison de Bonneterie, and this business was in competition with the business where my mother worked. There were actually family connections between the two businesses as well. It's a long story, there's a long history behind them. Both businesses eventually closed. The one where my mother worked was Hirsch & Company, which is today also a National Historic Building, is today the home of Apple in Amsterdam, at least in downtown Amsterdam. Where my father once worked, in 2014 became the home of the largest and upgraded store of H&M in the Netherlands. So that's the history of the buildings. And that's where my father had gone to work, also during the Depression years. And he lived not far away from where my mother and her parents were living in Amsterdam, because that was a Jewish area. But after they married in 1941, they moved to this home that I described earlier. It was near the home of the Frank family. And now my mother is in the third trimester of pregnancy. She's not able to hide her pregnancy at the very time that she and my father needed to find a hiding place. And no one was willing to take them into hiding. They were stuck. And they would remain stuck until several months after I was born at the end of the year. Fortunately, the Germans had not yet done any razzias in that area, otherwise we would not be having this conversation. Across the hallway from us lived some relatives. This was my father's double cousin. There were two David's family members who had married two Cohen brothers and sisters. In those days, it was quite common to have double cousins. She lived across the hallway from us, and next to her lived my mother's one aunt, a great aunt of mine, whom everyone called Tante Clara. And they were offered hiding without any trouble. But they decided they would want to wait with my parents to help with my birth. There were no nurses or anything like that available. There were no resources. And they said that they would wait until I was born, and then they would take up their hiding. And that's what happened. In fact, towards the end of the year, when I was 2 months old, the people that had offered them hiding said, "You need to come now." There are people who've been banging on our door for months, and we've tried to keep them at bay, telling them, well, we've got other people lined up. It's not fair to them. If you don't come right away, we have to give up your hiding places. So they left. And at that point, my birth parents realized that I had to be separated from them for us all to stand a chance. As long as I was with them, I would be a burden. Okay.
Was there a specific situation that led to you going into hiding?
Well, what led me to go into hiding, first of all, was the fact that we all three of us, my parents and I, needed to go into hiding because of these razzias. We had to stay away from the Germans. And now, not only that, I had to be taken into hiding separately from my parents, because while I was with them, they stood very little chance of finding a hiding place.
Did they find a hiding place?
We don't know if they initially found one after I was separated from them. We do know that they did find a hiding place a few months later, around the middle of March. Someone offered them a hiding place on a barge moored outside of Amsterdam. They were there for not more than maybe a week or so when someone betrayed them. The Germans came for them. They tried to make a run for it. The Germans fired at them from behind while they were running. They caught my father on the upper back lower shoulder area, and he went down. My mother didn't want to leave him, so she stopped running, and the two of them were arrested on the spot and sent to Westerbork. They arrived in Westerbork on March the 23rd, 1943. They were kept there for no longer than a week. There's a reason why that happened. Most people stay there for longer, but the Germans, this was a transit camp only. It wasn't a labor camp or a death camp. The Germans only kept you there for as long as they needed, until they knew whether they wanted you in a work camp or a death camp as part of the final solution. Very quickly, the final solution involved one of two things. All Jews that were able-bodied and needed for labor would be sent off to a labor camp, one of thousands of labor camps run by the Germans all over occupied Europe, and worked until they couldn't work anymore. All the others, those not needed for labor or those considered unfit for labor, would be shipped off to one of the 6 mass extermination camps with gassing operations in occupied Poland. That's how that worked. And Westerbork was the point for that because that's where all the Jews were collected, and then from there shipped. Most of them were shipped, as I mentioned earlier, either to Auschwitz or Sobibor, and then there were those few 8,000 or 9,000, the lucky ones, who were shipped off to camps like Buchenwald and Dachau and what have you to work, and there was an outside chance that they might survive the hard labor.
Where were your parents then after Westerbork?
So they were kept there for a week. On Tuesday, March the 30th, 1943, they were shipped off to Sobibor, one of the smallest of the 6 mass extermination camps. And based on the schedule that these trains had, we know a great deal about these camps, especially about Sobibor, from where there was a major escape in 1943, although my parents were long gone before that happened. But we know a lot about that for a number of reasons. There were 19 trains that were sent from the Netherlands, from Westerbork to Sobibor. They've been heavily researched by professional researchers. We know which one my parents were on, and we know what happened because we know that not a single person on that particular transport survived. And we know that the schedules consisted of the trains leaving Westerbork on a Tuesday and arriving either at Auschwitz or Sobibor late Friday afternoon, early evening. And Sobibor, being an efficient, small camp, the day you arrived at that camp was the day you died, usually within a few hours. And so almost certainly they would have died on Friday, April the 2nd, 1943. And I have certain paperwork that acts as evidence about that, which we may want to discuss later. That's how I know all those dates. That's how I know about the places.
Can you please describe your first hiding place?
So what happened was, after I was separated by my parents, I was taken by members of the resistance to a home of a Gentile Dutch family by the name of Den Os, D-E-N, and then second word O-S. Consisted of the parents and a young daughter. At the time I arrived there was already one young Jewish woman in hiding with them. When I arrived, that meant we were now 5. I stayed with them until around the middle of April 1945. By that time, I was about 6 months old. Someone betrayed us. We don't know who it was. After the war, they suspected it was a neighbor, but we never found out who it was. The Germans came to pick everyone up and to interrogate the family. They were especially interested in the father. His name was Gerard Den Os. They suspected that he knew people high up in the resistance, and they were looking for names to break the resistance. But on the day they arrived, there were too many of us to fit into their car because they were taking everyone away to be questioned. On that day, a niece was visiting, and that was one too many. I was not a problem. I was only a baby. They could fit me in anywhere. But the niece was one too many. So they told the niece, you stay here in the house with this baby. When we return, we expect you to both be here unless you want to get everyone into trouble. And they took the others away for interrogation. As I mentioned, they were especially interested in the father, Gerard Den Os. They beat him up badly. They left a big scar on his face, which would stay with him for the rest of his life. But he did not disclose anything to the Germans that they wanted to know. So they sent him off to a camp called Vught in the south of the Netherlands, a labor camp adjacent to the giant Philips electronics factory, hoping that the labor there would eventually break him and that he would come forward with something, but he never did. After 9 months, they gave up and they released him. The young Jewish woman who had been in hiding with him was also sent to Vught, and no one knows what happened to her. She disappeared. There's just no records of what happened to her.
Do you know her name?
We don't know her name. At least, well, somebody does, but it was never given to me. I found this out through certain information that was given to me later on, and they felt it wasn't necessary. If I really wanted to find her name, I would, but I don't know if it's necessary. It's not really part of my story, except it is kind of part of my story. It's part of our story. But they were not able to find her. Somebody had done extensive research, and the records at Vught were not complete, and many of the people who disappeared, so did the records. Meantime, the mother and the daughter had been brought back to the house. because the Germans realized that they didn't know anything and they were not going to send them to a labor camp. So the Germans bring them back to the house, and now they're going to pick me up and the niece. They come into the house, and the niece is tied to a chair with rope, and I'm gone. What had happened was a neighbor, I don't know her name, and I don't really need to, but a neighbor had noticed the Germans arriving with their car and banging on the door, and she knew all about me, and she knew all about this young woman in hiding. Most of the people on the street knew about it. And she quickly contacted a friend of hers who lived close by. His name was Wouter van Zeitzma, a very well-known leader and founder of the largest of 4 Dutch resistance groups formed by the Dutch people who rescued Jewish children. These were dedicated to rescuing Jewish kids. This was the largest of the groups. It was called the Amsterdam Students Group, made up mostly of young people, college kids, and socialists. His name was Wouter Zeitzma, and he quickly came over to see what was going on. He brought with him a helper who lived nearby, who was a student at Amsterdam University. Her name was It van Dijk. We know a great deal about her. She was a very ardent resistance worker. And the two of them watched from across the street while the Germans were loading everyone into the car. And they knew about me, and they knew about the young Jewish woman who had been in hiding. And they saw that she had been put into the car, but where's the baby? After the car left, they banged on the door and persuaded the niece to open up. And then they wanted to know where I was. The niece pointed to where I was, and they said, well, we have to take this baby out, but we don't want to get you into trouble. See if you can find a rope or twine or something, and we will tie you to this chair. And when the Germans come back, you'll make an excuse. These people came and said that they were working with the Germans. You need to let us in because they told us that you were here. So we let them in. And then they overpowered us, and there was nothing we could do. At least I could do. The baby couldn't do anything anyway. There was nothing I could do to prevent them from taking the baby out. And that was pretty much what happened. When the Germans came back, they interrogated her quite harshly. They didn't harm her when they realized that she really didn't know anything. And she didn't know the names of these people either. That's what they were really looking for, the names of the resistance people. So that's what happened there.
And when did that happen?
This happened around April 1943. I was about 6 months old at the time.
What happened after that?
Well, what had happened, I already explained what happened to my parents and what happened to the Den Os family. These two resistance people, Wouter van Zeitveld and his helper, It van Dijk, took me away to a building nearby. This was an annex of Amsterdam University. They were able to get in because It van Dijk, the student, had the keys to the annex because she did some extracurricular work there. And they stayed with me overnight in this building. The following morning, she took me with her to the city of Utrecht in the center of the Netherlands to be handed over to other members of the resistance group to be taken for further hiding. I should tell you about this group so that you can see the context. This was the largest of these 4 resistance groups that were dedicated to hiding Jewish kids. They had made prior arrangements with people in 2 different parts of the Netherlands to take Jewish kids into hiding in their homes. The majority of the kids were sent to the south, to a province called Limburg, which was predominantly Catholic. It's a kind of an appendage of the Netherlands, but it's certainly part of the Netherlands. It's sandwiched between Germany to the east and Belgium to the west. Predominantly Catholic. Many of the people who lived in this province had much darker appearance, darker, coloration of skin and so on, than other Dutch people who looked much more Germanic. And for that reason, they were prepared to take most of the Jewish kids who had a similar appearance. They were known as the coffee children because coffee is dark. And the majority of the Jewish kids were sent there. Then you had a small minority of Jewish children like me who had much lighter complexions, sometimes light hair, even blue eyes. I was born with blonde hair and blue eyes. And we were favored up in the north, in the province of Friesland, where arrangements had been made by 3 liberal church groups to take young Jewish kids into hiding in various villages scattered around the area. And that was why I was sent there. There was a fixation among the people of Friesland about boys. In those days, everyone in Europe knew it was only Jewish boys that were circumcised shortly after birth. It was therefore more dangerous to hide Jewish boys than Jewish girls. And they had some kind of fixation about that up in Friesland. They would only take Jewish boys if they had a Germanic appearance. And that's why I was sent there. And we were known as the tea children, tea being lighter than coffee.
And then what happened next?
So I was first taken to their headquarters of this group in a small town called Snake, spelled S-N-E-E-K, in the southern part of Friesland. They kept me there for only a few days, and now it was their turn to decide where I was going to be sent. They decided to send me to a tiny village called Hasterland in the southern part of the province, right on the edge of the IJsselmeer, which is the main enclosed lake of the Netherlands. The Netherlands has got all these enclosed lakes. Many of them are submerged below sea level. This was one of them. This is the main, known as the IJsselmeer. So this is a tiny little village. And then there were other Jewish kids that were hidden in other villages in the area as part of this program. Well, someone found out about this program and leaked it to the Germans. So now, for the second time, before I was even 12 months old, I'd been betrayed. The Germans began picking up all of us one by one in some kind of vehicle. There was an argument about whether it was a small truck or a bus. Does it really matter? Probably not. I was the first one they picked up because I was in the most southerly village and they were making their way from south to north. They then went to the next village to pick up the next kids, and by this time, the local resistance had found out what was going on, and someone was able to locate the truck or the bus parked outside a home in the next village. They had locked me inside, so I was on my own. The Germans had gone in probably to pick up the kids and to interrogate the occupants, so they had not yet come back. The resistance people quickly smashed the door open, got me out, put me on someone's bike, and wheeled me up the west coast of Friesland before the Germans could find out what had happened.
And what village was this happening in?
I'm sorry?
Where was this happening?
This was happening in the province of Friesland.
And when was it happening?
It was happening, the exact date they didn't give me. I'm going to guess and say around the middle of June to the end of June, maybe early July. In other words, midsummer. This was in the summertime, which was a good thing because they were able to then put me on a bike and take me. If this had been winter time, I'm not sure what they would have done. They might have had to use skates. I'm not sure what they would have done because it freezes up quite early there. And then they took me to a couple of little fishing villages along the way. I never found out the names, and I was never given them. There was a long story about this information becoming classified. There were all kinds of stories about why it was classified, which I didn't really buy, and why they kept moving me. My personal guess, based on what I know, was that my health had begun to deteriorate, and nobody wanted to keep me. They kept moving me from one place to the next. And we know that that was, in fact, the case, that my health had deteriorated by the end of the year, 1943. A few days before Christmas, I arrived in a canal town up in the north of the Netherlands called Dokkum. And by this time, they said that my body had become covered in sores. I was wearing only underwear with a wet towel around me and delirious, and nobody thought I had more than a couple of weeks left to live. People were scared to take me to the doctors. The doctors were not supposed to treat Jews anyway in the Netherlands. They had to turn you over to the Germans. And there were even some doctors who were members of the NSB, the Nationale Socialistische Beweging, the National Socialist Movement, a.k.a. the Dutch Nazi Party. So people were scared. I had been handed over to some local resistance workers in Dokkum, and now they had to scramble to see if they could find someone in one of the nearby country villages who was prepared to take me while I was still breathing. And eventually they came across a family of 6 living in a village 7 miles to the east called Engverum. This was the Bakker family. It was a family of 6. The parents were reluctant to take me. There were good reasons for that. The father of the family, Baron Bakker, was what you could call the local postmaster for the area. There was no real post office. Their house actually served as the post office. There was a large desk with a whole bunch of drawers and so on. And then on weekdays, he would put on his uniform, his postal uniform, get on his bike, and take his large postal satchel with him to deliver and pick up the mails in the area. But he also had things in that bag that didn't belong there, such as the latest updates from his friends in the resistance about resistance against the German occupation, such as maps and charts showing locations of the German military in the area, such as small pistols and ammunition to dole out to his friends in the resistance. So in addition to his official duties for the post office, he was also acting as a kind of a spy, a scout, a gun smuggler. In the house, he even had, up in the attic, he had a whole cache of rifles, Sten guns, ammunition. So he didn't want to get too involved, if he could help it, in taking people, especially into his home, in hiding. Although he had already assisted in placing Jewish people in the area but he and his wife were reluctant to take them in the home. His wife was reluctant for different reasons. In addition to having to take care of these 4 kids, all of them school-going. The son had just completed his first year at school. The eldest daughter, Hilda, had just become a teenager. This was during school vacations. She had to take care of the children. She had to take care of the home. And after the occupation, she opened up a tiny store right next to the house, selling pots and pans to try and sort of eke out some extra income for the family at a time when all over occupied Europe, there were people living under a time of great austerity. We want to realize that in the Netherlands, the Germans had carted away most of this food supply. They even took away live cattle by train into Germany. The borders of Germany and the Netherlands are pretty flat and very easy to get through. Plenty of road and rail connections. And it didn't take long. And kerosene and other energy supplies were also rationed. A system of rations and ration coupons had been implemented all over the Netherlands by the Germans. So she had opened up the store to try and get this extra income. So understandably, the parents were reluctant to take me, but nobody else wanted to take me. And up in this part of the Netherlands, most of the people are devout Calvinist Protestants, as they were. And although Jews are supposed to be their enemies, they're not going to let a baby die, especially not a few days before Christmas. So what they said they would do is, we'll keep him for 4 weeks. After the schools go back, someone else has to take him. Well, as it would turn out, during those 4 weeks, they began taking a liking to me, and they decided to keep me. But of course, at the beginning, when I first arrived, they had to find a doctor for me. And in their village, there was no doctor. The nearest doctor was Jarl Reinen, who was a friend of Baron Bakker and also a member of the resistance in a village called Eya, about 3 miles away. He had a car which was very unusual for that part of the Netherlands. And that car was very helpful, not only for his medical work, of course, but also for his resistance work. And he came over to the house. In those days, doctors made house calls. And he looked at me, but he said, I cannot treat this child. He's too ill. I'm only a family doctor, and he needs a specialist. Excuse me. So he said, I'm only a specialist, and he needs a family doctor. He needs a specialist. And I know some specialists in this area, but I'm not sure what they're going to do, how they'll react when they discover after they open him up that he's Jewish. Maybe they'll report him to the Germans. There is one specialist I know up in the province of Groningen. You'd have to take him there by train. It's quite far away. I think this doctor will be okay with him. In addition to being a good doctor, I don't think he'll report him to the Germans. You're going to have to take your chances. So the mother and the eldest daughter take me there by train. There's a story behind that. Maybe we can talk about it later. But the doctor examines me, he treats me, does not report me. The family brings the mother and the daughter bring me back to the house, and within 10 days I'm ill all over again. And this time the daughter has to take me on her own because the mother is busy with something urgent having to do with her little store. Once again, the doctor treats me, this time properly. Once again, he doesn't report me. So now I'm fine. Meantime, what does the family, they had to make a decision when they first took me. What are they going to do about me? Are they going to try and hide me? Well, they're not going to hide me in their attic. It's full of arms and ammunition. They did have a cellar, but by this time, the parents already had 4 children of their own who had all been my age once. I looked like I was around 12 months old. I was actually 14 months old. And the parents knew that at this age, children want to find their feet. You don't let them move around. They're going to yell and scream and draw attention. And they didn't want that kind of attention. So they decided they would take a chance, which resulted in a different kind of attention. They would allow me to wander around the house in full view of anybody, like any child of that age. And if the visitor wanted to know who this blonde child was, well, the story was that this child was a very sick child who had come from one of the big cities on the coast of the Netherlands, nothing about being Jewish. And the doctors had warned the parents, the air in this city is no good for this child. You need to send this child out in the countryside and get fresh air, even though it is wartime, because if you don't, the child's not going to recover. So that's what they did. Now out in the countryside, I start getting ill all over again, and now they start moving me from one place to another, which in my case was actually true. And now nobody wants him. It's Christmas time. We're not going to let him die, so he's with us. Okay. This was a little unusual. The usual story that people gave about people in hiding with him was that these were children who had come from Rotterdam after the bombing of Rotterdam, because at the beginning of the invasion, On day 4 of the invasion by the Germans, some German pilots had accidentally bombed a residential part of Rotterdam, leaving about 800 dead and tens of thousands homeless. That was not supposed to be the plan. They were supposed to have bombed the port area of Rotterdam to take over the waterways. In any case, that was the story that most people gave when people want to know who these children were that were staying with them. These were people who's from families whose homes had been bombed out in Rotterdam, and parents went this way and the children went that way. But for some reason, they never thought of that as the reason they gave this excuse about being sick. Okay. Either way, the people in the residents of the village didn't care one way or the other. Now, winter time comes and goes. Most of the spring has come and gone. Now they have us all playing outdoors as much as possible when it's not raining, which it did often, to try and get fresh air and exercise. German soldiers arrive in the area. What are we going to do with this youngster? Well, they decided they're not going to lock me up for the same reasons as before, but they decided to modify their story and tell the Germans a little different story. When the German soldiers would see me playing outdoors and they wanted to know who this blonde child was, oh, that's our youngest brother or our youngest son. And then hope that the Germans would take one look at my appearance and move on, and that's exactly what happened. So they took a pretty calculated gamble, and it sort of worked. Now, of course, this meant that there were now 2 different stories going in the village, one for the Germans and one for everyone else. And that didn't last long either. One day, the 2 youngest kids in the family came running into the house after school, telling the parents, all our friends at school are telling us that this Harry with us in the house is Jewish. You never seen anything about that before. How can that be? And the parents realized what had happened. Someone from the resistance who knew about me when I first arrived in the area and was supposed to be sworn to secrecy had opened his mouth maybe in front of the kids at the dinner table or whatever, and now everyone in the village knows about me, so now they have to come clean to the kids. And they tell the kids, look, it's true, he is Jewish. Just don't make a big fuss about it. But there were many people in the village who were very concerned about this. They and often their children had been in the house with us. You know, the kids would come and play, the parents would come and visit. And what might have happened if I'd been present and the Germans were there? And also by this time, all over occupied Europe, the Germans had developed a reputation for going after innocent neighbors if you did something wrong. So there was a lot of apprehension about that. There was one man who even threatened to report us. Everyone in the village hated him. They called him Sayer the Swine. I don't know what his last name was. And they called him that because he was a member of the Nazi party. And one day he came up to Baron Bakker in the street and said, I know that young child with you in the house there is Jewish. I'm going to report you to the Germans. And Baron Bakker said to him, you say one word, you get a bullet between your eyes. And that was enough to deter him from saying anything to anybody.
So what happened on the train with the mother and the daughter?
Well, it wasn't so much what happened, but what could have happened. The parents, the mother realized that the Germans were in control of everything. They were in control of the train stations. They had their inspectors on the trains and so on. And this was a long trip. What might happen, the Germans might get suspicious and they might want to know who this baby was and why you're carrying the baby around during winter time and so on, because this is in the dead of winter. And so she devised a plan. She would hold me on her knees or lap on one seat in the train, and the eldest daughter would sit on another seat near the window. And these windows you could open. There was a lot of snow outside. And the arrangement was that if the German inspector becomes suspicious, she would toss me to the daughter, and the daughter would either try and make a run for it, and if she couldn't, she would toss me out the window into the snow and then hope for the best. Because they knew that once I'm in German custody, that's the end. And fortunately for them, because of my appearance again, nothing happened. The inspector looked at me apparently, and the 2 of them were really anxious about it, but he sort of just let it go. He didn't even ask them why they were taking a baby with him on the train. And the same thing coming back, and the same thing when the daughter went on her own.
Did you look like the family you were staying with?
Well, I can show you a picture, but the picture doesn't really tell you the story because this picture was taken after the war with me and the rescuing family and was taken in a portrait studio and it was backlit. So when it's backlit, the hair looks much darker than it would if the lighting was from the front. But I have other pictures in here where you can see that I was blonder than any other person in the family.
And can you spell the last name of the family?
Yes, Bakker.
And what were the first names of the family
So the
members?
mother's name was Jeltje, Jeltje. The father's name was Berend or Berend, Berend. I'm pronouncing them the Dutch way, and there's a story behind that too, because where I lived in Friesland, their home language was not Dutch. I can tell you about that later if necessary. And the daughters, the eldest daughter, her name was Hilda or Hiltje. The second daughter was, I have to think about it, Sitska, they called her, or Sits. The third daughter, the youngest daughter, was Ulrike or Rikje, and the son's name was Harm, Harm.
And what ages were they when you were with them?
The eldest daughter at that time was about 13. The next daughter, Sitska, would have been about 11. Rick would have been about 8, or actually 7, 8 when I arrived. And Harm was not yet 7. He was still 6 years of age.
And how long were you with them?
Well, that's a very good question. World War II ended in Europe in May 1945. Where we were liberated by the Canadians in April 1945. At that time, I was 2.5 years old. And I'd been with them for about 16 months. But I would stay with them until for at least another 7 months, because it took 7 months before anyone who mattered found out that I was alive. And I continued staying with them until certain things started happening.
And any of your time in hiding, did you go by any other name?
Yes, they gave me a hiding name, but that name was only used among the rescuers and among the resistance. The name was Breukelaar, Breukleaar. And they kept my first name, because Harry was quite a common name in the Netherlands. It was a strange name to have in Friesland, though. I was surprised they didn't change it, especially because their youngest son, the first 3 letters of his name were the same as mine, Harm, Harm.
So when did you go by this name?
Once the resistance picked me up, they started giving you a name from the time that they first had you in custody, which meant from the time I was 2 months.
And did you have any false papers with this name?
No, and that's a very good question. I cannot speak for other countries, but in the Netherlands, if you were under the age of 6, you did not need papers. Now, the advantage of that was that it meant that the resistance did not need to forge papers for you. But the opposite side of the story was that because you didn't have to have papers, nobody knew anything about you. And if you were this age, you couldn't tell them anything about you when you were 2 months old. So all they could do was pass my name, both my hiding name and my first name, down by word of mouth from one person to the next. And that would be a problem when the time came to get me after the war.
What languages did you speak when you were
I spoke
hiding?
only one language, and that was the Frisian language. The first 2 months of my life, I spoke only baby language. And after being separated, I'm not sure if I might have spoken Dutch at any time until I became 6 months old. That's a possibility. But after I was taken to Friesland, the children get immersed very quickly in new languages. And their home language was the Frisian language, because the Frisian people who live in Friesland, even though they're Dutch, they're very proud of their heritage. This is something that goes back centuries. And they have retained large part of their culture, including their language, the cuisine, their literature, and what have you. And so you only start learning Dutch when you go to school, because that's a requirement. And I left the Netherlands at the age of 4.5 before going to school. And therefore, the only language I spoke, except possibly for Dutch in the first 6 months of my life, would have been Frisian.
Did you have any contact with others in hiding?
After the war, yes, many people. But that was many, many decades later.
And did any family members know where you were during this process?
So that's a very good segue, because I mentioned to you earlier that it was 6 months after the war before anyone who mattered found out about me. So I was still staying with the Bakker family 7 months after the war ended, which means almost the end of 1945. Actually, in early January 1946, what happened was After the war ended, the new government of the Netherlands started passing laws to get the country back to normal as soon as possible. One of these laws required people that had harbored refugees in hiding to turn their names over to the government so they could be listed and then reunited with their loved ones, try and get the country back to normal as soon as possible. That didn't happen right away. There were tens of thousands of people that were living in the Netherlands who had fled as refugees from other countries. Not only people in hiding were born in the Netherlands like myself, people coming from countries like Poland, Austria, even Germany, and many of them were not happy about the idea of being repatriated to their home countries. So a lot of people didn't want their names divulged. And in my case, it was difficult because nobody knew anything about me, except for two people in my whole extended family who even knew I existed. That's those two ladies, our relatives, who helped with my birth, who were living across the hallway from us when I was born. They were safely in hiding throughout the war, my father's cousin and my mother's aunt. And after the war, when these lists of people coming out of hiding started being published, they started pouring through these lists. My father's cousin noticed this one name, Harry, all on its own, without a last name and without an exact age. They had to guess an age because there were no papers. And she and my great-aunt wondered if this might be me. They made an appointment to come and visit us in Friesland. They were able to identify me. That's another story on its own. They then returned to Amsterdam, where they were living at the time, although my father's cousin was actually now living in Utrecht with her husband. And my father's cousin still had the addresses of her cousins living in other parts of the world. What had happened was, before the war, my parents had moved to the Netherlands, as you know, but my mother had only one brother, and he came with her to the Netherlands. My father came from a much larger family. He was one of 8 siblings. There were 3 boys and 5 girls. There were 2 younger brothers. The middle brother had left Germany at the age of 20 to find work because he had lost his job in Germany. The Nazis were beginning to make inroads in Germany. They only came into power in 1933, but this was 1931, at the height of the Great Depression, which Germany probably suffered harder than anyone else. And he'd been laid off. He was 20 years old, and fortunately for him, some friends of the family by the name of Stern or Stern in Germany had relatives by the same name living in a small country town in South Africa who owned a small wholesale business. And they were looking for someone just like him who could speak German, preferably Jewish, which they were, young, honest, hardworking, all that kind of stuff. And he saw no future for himself in Germany, not only because of the economic problems, but because the Nazis were making so much headway. And he decided to take up their offer and go on his own and start a new life on his own in Africa at the age of 20. A few years later, he made a return trip to Germany. Somehow he managed to save enough money to make a return trip to visit his parents, my grandparents. He didn't realize at the time it would be the last time he would see them. But he was with them for a few years and stayed in Germany until around 1937 and was able to persuade his youngest brother, my youngest uncle, who had just turned 17 and just completed school in Germany, to leave Europe as well and join him in Africa and start a new life there as well. So there were these 2 brothers that my father had. Then there were 5 sisters. One of the sisters was the middle sister. Everyone called her Helena. That was her second name, because in those days it was common to call people by their second names, not their first given name. She died, her name was Annie. She died at the age of 13 from tuberculosis and is buried in Germany. I've actually seen her gravesite. And that was in between the wars. Then that left 4 sisters. 2 sisters were married before the war began and made a smart move unbeknownst to them and left Europe before the war started as well. One went with her husband to Chile in South America, the other with her husband to Palestine before it became Israel. So this meant then that I had 2 uncles and 2 aunts who were all living in safe countries during World War II outside the field of battle, and would therefore all be alive when the war was over. Their brothers and sisters and their parents would not be so lucky. So that's the story about them. So then there were all these cousins and great aunts and most of them moved from from Germany to the Netherlands as well. They could never have imagined that they would have been safer staying in Germany than moving to the Netherlands. The stats are straightforward. 27% of the Jews of the Netherlands survived, 50% of the Jews of Germany survived. You had an 85% better chance to survive in Germany than in the Netherlands. They have the highest mortality rate of Jews in any part of Western Europe. So most of them did not survive. But there were some, like my cousin and my great aunt, my father's cousin and my great aunt, who had survived, and they now came out of hiding, and they now contacted these two uncles of mine and these two aunts, the two uncles in Africa, the aunt in Chile, the aunt in Palestine, updating them on family news from Europe. Were they aware that my parents had married during the war? That came as a complete surprise. We have to believe that my birth father had tried to send at least a postcard or something to one of them to let them know that he had gotten married or was getting married, and yet none of them had received it. Based on my own research about the mail in occupied Europe, it turned out that the Nazis, the Germans, were censoring the mail, especially mail going to and coming from overseas countries, and would often not only censor the mail, but simply trash it. So the conclusion that most of us have come to is that the Germans probably just trashed the postcard or whatever it was that my father had tried to send them to let them know that he was getting married. Now my father's cousin has to share with them the news that none of them had survived. They had both died. But guess what? They had a son, and he's your nephew. Who wants to come and claim him? It's actually a somewhat longer story, because what happened was the Den Ost family found out after the war that I had survived, and they tried to adopt me. My father's cousin, the one who gave him all this news, said that if nobody comes from the family to adopt me, she'll adopt me. And she made application with her husband, her then husband. They were already having matrimonial problems. I suspect that she wanted to adopt me to try and solidify the marriage. But whatever the reason, they tried to adopt me, and the court said that they didn't consider them fit to be my parents. So now she writes to these others, and now the eldest of the two brothers in Africa decides he's now going to come forward. By this time, he's already married. He has a daughter. She's 2 years old at the time that this news breaks that there's a nephew alive in Europe. He had started up a small business several years ago, and the business was doing quite well. And he would often have my aunt, his wife, help out in the business. But at the time that this news breaks about a nephew alive in Europe, his wife has just learned she's expecting the second child. She's having these morning sicknesses. And now she can't help him run the business while she's in that position, especially in the mornings. And he sometimes goes away on business. He did have a cashier in the business, but she had quit on him just 2 weeks earlier. So now he has to have more or less hire off the street somebody to take cash and to run the business in his absence while he's away in Europe. So he was under enormous pressure. And things didn't work out for him the way he had hoped time-wise. First, he comes to our house. He told me about this visit when he came to visit us, to visit the Bakker family, and they told me about it too. They were actually quite cordial to him. But then when he expressed the interest in, this is my nephew, there's nobody else alive, it's my duty to take this child on behalf of the parents who are not alive anymore. That was when the family said, oh no, you're not going to do that. This child sees only one family, and that's us. He can't even speak your language. You've never met him before. You know nothing about him. We're not going to, strip him away from us. So he had to return empty-handed to Amsterdam, but decided he wasn't going to accept the situation, hired an attorney, and started up a lawsuit for custody of me against my own rescuing family.
And how old were you when this was happening?
At that time, I would have been about 4 years old. Not quite 4 years old, maybe. And remember, I was still staying with the Bakker family. And the lawyer finds out from my uncle that he's in a big hurry. He's got a pregnant wife at home, a young daughter of 2, and a business being run by a total stranger. He's under pressure to get home as soon as possible. So he needs all kind of documentation. For a hearing like this, you have to do all kinds of things. You have to prove who you are, how you're related to this child, prove that both parents are gone, because without that, neither the Bakkers nor he would have been entitled to custody, and so on and so on. They need all kinds of documentation. because it's a bureaucratic organization. And my uncle wasn't in a position to do that. He couldn't even speak Dutch. He wouldn't know where to first start looking. So the lawyer had to hire a private investigator, a PI, to gather all this information at great cost. I found out later, and he never told me about it, and I never asked him about it, but I found out later that my uncle had actually borrowed against his life insurance policy to pay for the attorney and to pay for the PI. But he was persistent, so they had to gather all this documentation for the case. And he won the case, but by the skin of his teeth. He did win it through a very strange set of circumstances. And because what happened was it was a tribunal of 4 people headed by a judge. And the 4 had to decide whether I was going to go to stay with the Buckers or go to my uncle. And the 4 of them were deadlocked, 2 sided one way, 2 the other way. That was when the judge, under the rules, had to intervene and break the deadlock by deciding one way or the other. Afterwards, when he was interviewed, he said this was one of the most difficult cases he ever had to adjudicate. But he asked a question which nobody had thought of. His question was, does this child have any friends in the village? And the answer was, no, he doesn't, because during the war years, we had to keep him away from everybody else. Everybody in the village found out about him, and he was like kryptonite. We can't have our children next to his, and so on. And by the time he was, 3.5, 4 years old, all these other children had made their own friendships. It was difficult, and the children in the Baka family were taking care of me. I was their plaything. He didn't really need too many. Well, that was the way that it played out. The judge was not happy to hear that. He said, this child needs to start socializing, and he's not going to be able to do that in this village. Everyone knows about him. He found out about that everyone in the village knew that I was Jewish. What's going to happen when he starts going to school? Who's going to befriend him? He's already behind in socialization. He should already have some social skills. It seems to me that he doesn't. He never questioned me. I don't remember it, but I found out that he never asked me to appear in court. But he says it's clear from the testimony given that he's way behind in his social skills, and he's going to stay behind until he starts going to school, and he's going to have trouble there. He needs to start a clean slate, and for the best interest of the child, it's better that the uncle takes him. So that came as a complete surprise even to my uncle.
And you were how old when this was happening?
At that point, I was around 4 years old, and the problem was that my uncle thought it would be a simple matter to put me on a plane with him and take me to Africa and get all this stuff in Europe behind us. It didn't happen that way. He eventually did get me there, but it would only be 2 years after liberation, May 1947. If you want to leave a country to go to another country, you need a passport. If you want a passport, you have to be a citizen of that country. And unlike the United States, being born in the Netherlands it does not make you a valid citizen. They have different rules. In fact, the way it worked was that under Dutch laws, I was a stateless alien. It has to do with your parents. Your parents had to be Dutch citizens at the time you were born. It doesn't matter where you were born. It doesn't even matter where your parents were born. They had to be Dutch citizens at the time you were born. They had been stripped of their German citizenship by the Nazis. They had attempted to apply for Dutch citizenship by writing to the Queen. That's how you did it formally. I actually have a copy of the draft letter that they wrote. And, and then the bureaucrats would take care of the paperwork, and after a certain time, this would happen and that would happen, just like in the United States, and you might become naturalized. Unfortunately for them, their application was still pending for Dutch citizenship at the time that Germany invaded the Netherlands. Now there was no Department of Immigration anymore, and the application went nowhere. My birth parents were stateless at the time I was married, and therefore so was I. There was only one plan B, and that was what they called a stateless alien passport. This was a passport that millions of people all over Europe were seeking at the time. They were living in the wrong countries at the wrong time with no papers or the wrong papers. And for this kind of passport, you had to wait your turn. You couldn't send in $150 and you get it in 4 weeks' time or whatever. My uncle, had to go back to Africa without me and wait for all the documentation to come through. Before he did that, he could already see I was having so much trouble with everyone. He already had to fight my rescuing family. He already had to fight the Dutch government. he thought he better check in with the South African consul and make sure that there were no impediments to my entry into the country. And there were. The South African government was a little bit behind the times. They had not yet moved away from a war footing. The South Africans had sent forces over to Europe to join the Allies to fight against Germany. Many of them were still on European soil, had not yet come back. There were concerns that they might not have jobs when they came back, because after a big war, there's always issues about unemployment. And so they had this law that said, during wartime, that says, we will not accept anybody into the country unless they are either returning soldiers coming back from the front or actual parents or actual children, no one else. So my uncle had to have a big argument with them, and he begged and cajoled them, and eventually they said to him, okay, here's what we're going to do. While you're here in the Netherlands, before you go back, you're going to fill out all this documentation to adopt this child. You'll take it with you to Africa, your wife will sign it, and so on. We're going to have the South African welfare authorities, who are the ones in charge of adoption. They're going to be watching you closely. If there's any evidence of the two of you being bad parents, back he comes to the Netherlands, and then it's your problem. And for all these reasons, he would have to wait for months and months on end. He had to fight everybody. It would only be in May 1945, when I was 4.5 years old, that he would be able to return to the Netherlands on a return trip and then put me on a plane to take me back to Africa with him.
Sorry, what was that date one more time?
I'm sorry?
What was the date when you returned?
That would have been May 1947.
Okay. And shall we take a break?
Sure. Good idea.
So when we left off, you were describing the Cussie battle. How did you travel to South Africa?
By plane. As a matter of fact, up to the point that I was on the flight, up to that point, I clearly blocked off everything from my mind. I don't even remember saying goodbye to my rescuing family, none of that. And the first recollections I had of anything were by accident, by kind of a flashback. In South Africa, at the age of 6, my first year at school, my new parents came up to me and asked me whether I was aware that they were not my real parents. And that did I recall being brought to South Africa a year and a half earlier at the age of 4.5 by my uncle to be adopted into the family, because my real parents had been killed at the time of a big war that happened in Europe. Did I recall any of that? And I was totally shocked. I had absolutely no recollection, and I still don't. But after they told me this, within a few months, I started having some flashbacks, and I had one flashback of being on a plane and running up and down the aisles. And my new father said, yeah, you caused me a lot of embarrassment. You were screaming at the top of your lungs, running up and down the plane. You had no idea what the plane was going to do, what the planes were for. And then later on the flight, your ears began bleeding, which was very common in those days, because in those days the planes were not pressurized. Many people had ears bleed, and it was never a serious issue unless you happen to be a hemophiliac. Then you've got problems, but most of us aren't. And you said you made a huge deal out of that, which I didn't remember. But then I had a flashback of arriving in the new house, squinting in sunshine. I remember squinting in sunshine because I wasn't used to it. And meeting my new mother and my new sister and seeing this huge Great Dane come running towards me. You know, when you're a child at that age, those are the things that seem important to you. So I had flashbacks like that. And of course, I remember growing up in the country, obviously, as I grew older. But I had no recollections of what happened to me in the Netherlands. I did on one occasion when I was at school. Then they were teaching us about the Netherlands, about how the people went out into the fields and would wear these, what they used to call clogs. I don't know what they call them in the United States. In Dutch, they call them klompen. And that night, I had a flashback of wearing heavy things on my feet. And when I went back to visit my rescuing family when I was in my 20s, I asked them about that. I said, did you ever wear did we wear these klompen out here? And then they all looked at each other, because I said, I remember having heavy things on my feet. And they looked at each other, and then the eldest daughter burst out laughing. She said, we were trying to teach you to skate. We never used to wear stuff like that. We were trying to teach you to skate. That's what you had on your feet. So even the flashbacks, they're not what you think they are.
And what were the names of your aunt and uncle, your new parents?
Hetty and Paul Davids.
And how do you spell those names?
So Paul is Paul. Hetty is Hetty.
And what were your sisters' names?
So when I arrived, there was one sister, my new sister. Her name is Merle, Merle. My new sister, who was born 3 months after I arrived, that was the one that my new mother was expecting when the news came about me. Her name is June. And a third sister was born a year after that. Her name is Daphne. So you can see that within 16 months, instead of one child in the family, there are now 4.
And where in South Africa were you living?
So we lived in a town called Springs. And this town is a gold mining town located about 30 miles east of Johannesburg. At that time, Springs was arguably the wealthiest town on earth because there was more gold sitting under the ground in Springs than in anywhere else in the country at that time. That would change. But at that time, there were 13 different gold mining companies operating in the area.
And what was your childhood like in South Africa?
Mostly normal. Mostly normal. The first year at school, though, there was some anti-Semitism. I remember there were some of the bullies in the class would pick on us. There were only a few Jews in the class. They would pick on us. But after that, it went away. There were special reasons why it went away, having to do with the South African government. We don't have to discuss that today. But I didn't experience all that much by way of anti-Semitism, except maybe in the first year of school.
And were you at school with your sisters?
No. No, we were not in the same school. Except in the first few years, the elementary school, there it was co-ed. In those days, it was very common for girls and boys from high school on to be in separate schools. There was no junior or middle school in South Africa. There was what we call primary school, which would be the equivalent of elementary plus junior school or middle school, then high school. So there were really only 2 different school systems. So while I was at elementary school, during that time, we weren't in the same class. Obviously, we were different ages, but we would often be in the same school together. But from high school, we were separate. But the 2 high schools in Springs were within arm's throw of each other. One school was here, the other school was like 2 blocks away.
And were there many Jewish communities, and was there a big Jewish community?
Not really.
In Springs?
I don't think there were more than maybe 400 or 500 families who were Jewish in our town. And the town had a total population of about maybe 45,000 people. It wasn't particularly large, although we were adjacent to a very large black township where you had 100,000 people. And if you treat that as a separate city, which it really was because it was miles away, these townships, the way the whites constructed them, they made sure that they're out of sight and out of mind so that when visitors came, they wouldn't see how squalid they were. It was a really bad thing. This was part of the apartheid system, or apartheid, called it, which means segregation. We're talking about the most segregated country on earth. I arrived in 1947. The following year, 1948, the Afrikaner nationalists took over the government, and they implemented this statutory apartheid where it was mandatory for the races to be segregated. Yeah.
Were you a part of any political activity or political
Yes.
movements?
When I turned 21, that was my final year at college. I joined a new political party that had been formed. We have to realize that in South Africa, the politics were that if you were white, you ran the country. If you were not white, you were a second-class citizen. You had no right to vote. You had inferior education, housing, transportation, and whatever else you can think of. And under the apartheid system, the theory was that all people of color had to move back to their ancestral homelands, and that's where they could vote, and that's where they could, make use of whatever benefits were available to them there. And the idea was that these would be separate but equal benefits. It never was. Separate for sure, equal never. It was a sham from the beginning. Also, there were millions of people who came from these ancestral homelands who had never set eyes on them, who were even born in these townships adjacent to white cities and towns where they and their families worked, who were in limbo. They had no rights at all because they were not living in a white area. And if they did, they couldn't vote because they were not white. They were not living in an ancestral homeland, and therefore they couldn't do anything there. So they had no rights at all. So the whole thing was a sham. When I turned 21, I joined a new party called the Progressive Party. And the idea behind the Progressive Party was not to completely dismantle apartheid altogether because the population we felt wasn't ready for it. At least the whites were not. What we would do is we would gradually make it easier and easier for people of color to vote and provide extra funding so that they would gradually be brought into the fold so that if over time everybody would be equal. It just didn't work. The population, the voters were not ready for it. And the reality was that they were going to have to come to account, come to grips with the African National Congress that had started while I was already at college. In the earlier days when I first came to the country, black people in South Africa were generally very passive, very submissive. That changed because now we have their young generation were coming up, and now we were entering the communications age. They couldn't, although television was only introduced into the country in 1972, they could not prevent anybody from learning what was happening in other countries, that people had rights that they never had, and so on. And the younger generation began to protest, became loud, became vocal, and eventually became violent. Okay, and people like me, we were like dinosaurs. Our time to make changes had come and gone. This was going to have to be between the Afrikaner nationalists who implemented the system and the black people. And that was the way, that was the reality of it. We were able to vote into power one solitary member of parliament, which is like our Congress. Her name was Helen Suzman. She was my hero, but on her own, she couldn't do anything. There just wasn't the support.
Did your political activity, was it influenced by your own personal
Absolutely.
history? Could you tell me more about that?
Most of my friends were much more conservative. They thought that apartheid was probably a good idea because there was this huge cultural chasm, this huge gap between the different ethnic groups. There's no question about it. And you can't even compare them with, say, the African Americans of the United States, whose home language is English. Many of their customs and traditions are English and so on. That goes back, and they were also descendants of slaves, not the black South Africans. There was a certain group, a certain part of the population that did have slave ancestry, but not of African ancestry, except maybe Somalia. These were the people in South Africa known as coloureds, which had a very different meaning from what the coloured used to mean in the United States, which was African American. These were people initially who had been brought by the Dutch seafarers back in the 17th and 18th centuries from the Spice Islands, which we today call Indonesia, Malaysia, these countries. They'd been brought as slaves to southern Africa, by the sailors and so on. And then later you had people of mixed ancestry where you had black and white marrying or not marrying or whatever. And those people make up quite a large percentage of the population, maybe as much as 4 to 4.5 million today, out of a total population of 6. But they had almost no rights either, okay? And so you had this strange thing, and they couldn't vote. They were not part of our thing. But my friends saw this big gap. We didn't socialize with them. They lived in their own townships far away and so on. We didn't go to school with them. We couldn't. The law didn't allow us to mix with them. They were supposed to be separate but equal development, which there never was, but it certainly was separate. So we never got to know the majority of the people of our own country this way, which I felt was not right. My friends thought I was a little bit crazy, but they knew my background, so they understood it.
And how did your religious observance change in the post-war period?
Well, it didn't really change. Let me explain to you what I mean. I was too young to really know anything about religion. I was told that when I was in Holland, that the Bakker family on Sundays when I was old enough, would have me come into church services with them because they didn't want me to stay at home and scream and yell, and there were Germans outside. So I had to go with them. But then they admitted later that they even had me sing in the church. But of course, I didn't know what I was singing. I didn't know from anything. When you're 3 years old or whatever it is, what can you know about religion? When I was in South Africa, at the age of 6, my first year at school, that was when I was taken by my new parents for the first time to a synagogue service. And it wasn't actually a synagogue. It was somebody's, it was a milling company owned by Jewish people, a huge shed, a warehouse, which they'd converted into a temporary synagogue while they were building a new one. In fact, actually, as a kid, I watched that new one being built. That synagogue is no longer a synagogue. All the Jews of that town have left. And that was when I came in with my new parents, and everybody turned around and stared at us because they knew a bit about the story about me. But so when you say influence, not really. Religion didn't play much of a part in my attitudes, not really.
And did you visit the Netherlands often, or did you
Not
ever go
all that
back?
often. My first return trip was in the 1960s when I was I think I was 26 years old. And that was when I met up for the first time since I'd left Holland with my rescuing family in the same house, as a matter of fact. Unfortunately, the father had died a few months earlier. I would never get to know him for that reason. He died relatively young. But all the others were there with their own families, of course. By this time, they were all adults.
And when did you move to America?
So I moved to the United States in 1979.
Where to?
I moved to San Diego first.
Was there a reason?
Yeah, there were certain family members that were living there, having to do with my, actually an in-law, my one brother-in-law, had family who lived there, and they welcomed us and so on. And there was another reason. San Diego most closely approximated the type of lifestyle and weather that we were used to in the part of South Africa where we lived. So we liked the conditions there.
How did you begin researching your own post-war experiences?
Well, I suppose you could argue that I began researching from the time that my new parents told me at the age of 6 what had happened, because I was full of questions, and of course they were not going to give me answers. They were trying to find out what I remembered. They had actually planned to tell me much later in life, but they chose for certain reasons to do it sooner rather than later, my first year at school.
And when you were an adult, how did you begin researching?
I'm sorry, how did?
When you were an adult, how did you begin researching, or was there a reason you began researching?
Well, it was very sporadic and haphazard, because in the old days there was no information. Plus, as you probably know, people didn't speak about the Holocaust in those days, not in the earlier years. Most people were still talking about the military war of World War II, which was a different war, which involved a much larger number of people. People talking about how our boys did this, how our boys came home or didn't come home. So that was of much greater interest to people than this genocidal war that happened to these other people. And Jews didn't like talking about it because it was a source of shame for them.
In what ways have your experiences affected you?
They've certainly affected my attitude about people having respect for each other, people coming forward as upstanders instead of being bystanders. In those respects, they've definitely influenced my thinking, no question about that.
And do you ever encounter Holocaust denial, and what are your thoughts on Holocaust?
Not many, but I have encountered some. I sometimes give tours at Holocaust Museum Los Angeles, and I came across one set of deniers there, but these were like run-of-the-mill people. They didn't really know much. They were kind of ignorant. It would be much harder to have an argument, a discussion with really serious Holocaust deniers. There are some on more serious side who've done their homework. Many of them know much more about the Holocaust than most Jews do, except that they only know those parts that help them make the case that that the Holocaust never happened.
Is there anything else you would like to add to your testimony today?
I'm sorry?
Is there anything else you would like to add to your story today?
Not really. I think if young people listening to this testimony, this is a challenge to you to think about what it means to be upstanders rather than bystanders, to learn what it means when you don't respect people, you don't treat people as equal only because they happen to have a different, skin color or hair or eyes or whatever you like to call it. Because if you don't, the world is simply going to continue on this merry way doing exactly what it does before, which is just continue having genocides. We know a great deal about genocide today, how they start, how they develop, how they end, and yet they still continue. And it's going to be the challenge of younger generations, I'm afraid, to try and press the hot buttons of our political leaders, because only they can stop genocides. It has to be stopped on a large scale. So it requires intervention by politicians at the end of the day. Hopefully they'll be statesmen more than politicians. So hopefully the younger generations will come up to that challenge and do something. Our generation has not done that well.
Thank you. Please describe this photograph.
So that is a photograph of my mother and her brother, my uncle Werner. It was taken in the city of Kassel in Germany in a studio. My mother would have been about 8 and Werner would have been about 10 years of age. It's the only photograph I have of either of them. He was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942, shortly after the Final Solution program began in the Netherlands. And my mother was murdered in Sobibor in the following year in April.
What year was this photograph taken in?
The photograph, I don't know if there's a marking on it, but I'm going to guess. I would say we've been taken about 1915, somewhere around there.
Thank you.
And how old were they when they died in the concentration camps? Do you know?
My mother was, I think, 28. He would have been about 30. He was unmarried, so he died single.
Thank you.
Please describe who's in this photograph.
So these two people are my maternal grandparents, Hugo Berg and Mary Berg. They came from the city of Warburg, a small town in Germany, and both of them perished. Hugo Berg died in the transit camp known as Westerbork in the Netherlands. The Germans did not send him off to a death camp because he was already ailing. He died at the age of 70 inside the Westerbork camp, somewhat unusual. My grandmother Mary has a very unusual history at that time. She was taken to Westerbork. She remained in Westerbork after Hugo died for several months. She was kept there all the way until February 1944 and then shipped to another transit camp called Theresienstadt near Prague in Czechoslovakia, what was then Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic. She was kept there until around August, September 1944 and shipped into the 60s from there to Auschwitz and murdered in Auschwitz on the day of my second birthday.
Thank you. Please tell me about this document.
The significance of this document has to do with the fact that the first mass murders by the Nazis were not of Jews nor of so-called gypsies or people like that. The first murders were their own people. These were people who were severely mentally handicapped and also later severely physically handicapped who were institutionalized. The position of the Nazis was that these people made no contribution to German society. They were nothing but useless eaters. They were living a life not worthy of life, as they called it, and they therefore would be given a merciful death. And they were killed off under what you could call a kind of a human euthanasia program that began around the same time that World War II began in 1939. It was supposed to have been done clandestinely. The word got out. The churches found out about it. The public generally began to find out about it. And, you know, you're talking about a lot of people from a lot of different families all over Germany, and we're not necessarily, you know, this included Jewish people, but it wasn't intended to be a racial thing. This was about people who were not considered, you know, to have life worthy of life. And when the word got out, there were complaints and protests. The Nazi Party first attempted to bring the population around to their way of thinking by putting up posters like this: 60,000 German marks is what it costs to keep this chronically ill individual alive during his lifetime. Countrymen, this is your money too. So they were trying to make a kind of financial economic argument for the thing, but the Germans didn't buy it. And eventually they said, okay, we've stopped doing it. In actual fact, they continued doing it secretly almost till the end of the war. No one knows the exact number of people murdered. We know at a minimum that over 73,000 were killed based on Germany's own records that survived the war. Many of the experts in the field, though, believe that the number could be upwards of 250,000. So these then were the first mass killings. Not in gas chambers, not in camps, not in shootings.
Thank you. you.
It's important for people to understand how genocides develop. And here you have the seeds, as I referred to it earlier, you have the seeds of genocide planted with something like this. Because during the course of the program, they tried many different methods of fast, efficient, and cheap killing, and they hit upon the idea of using carbon monoxide gas, which would later be the nucleus of the programs in the 6 mass extermination camps in occupied Poland as part of the final solution to get rid of the Jews.
Thank you.
Which, by their standards, was highly efficient and highly successful, actually.
Please describe this document.
This document is a dual passport. It shows the pictures of both my paternal grandparents, and it was taken and applied for and signed off on only 5 weeks after the event known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The small home in which they lived had been badly damaged, and they realized that they could no longer stay in Germany. My grandfather had served in the Home Guard in the German army in World War I. He had not paid attention when Jews were no longer able to fly the national flag of Germany, the new swastika. That was prohibited. They couldn't fly any flag of Germany, in fact. And that should have been a big red flag for him, but never was. And it was only after Kristallnacht that he realized that his status in Germany was now endangered, and he and my grandmother needed to get out. My one aunt, their second eldest daughter, was still in Germany at the time, and she helped them apply for this special visa, a passport, to get out of Germany, which the Germans had no problems in giving them because they wanted Jews out of Germany at that time. And you can see I don't know how clear it is, there's a swastika on their stamp, and within a few weeks they were gone, they were out of Germany.
And the J?
Now you have a J there. That J, which stands for Judo, which means Jew, is nothing more than a sign that this is a one-way exit permit. In other words, Jews leaving Germany can leave, but they can't come back. So the J was a symbol that you are now out of Germany for good.
Just going to get a wide again, just to make sure we got the whole thing.
Well, he essentially died in the military in the genocidal war because what happened was the two of them actually escaped into the Netherlands the day after the Netherlands closed their borders with Germany. There were too many Jews streaming into Germany after Kristallnacht, and on December 15th they closed their borders. There's evidence that the two of them got into the Netherlands the very next day, and how they got in we don't know. We suspect that my great-uncle had used his power and influence to let them in, but we don't know. There's no record. They ended up in a retirement home in the city of Gouda, which we would pronounce Gouda, like Gouda cheese. Mm-hmm. It's the same town. It was a Jewish retirement home, which was raided by the Nazis in May 1943. All the residents were taken out to Westerbork. All of them died. The only interesting question is how they died. This grandfather was also 70 years old. In the retirement home, he had developed kidney failure, and they had put him onto dialysis, which was relatively new in those days. Obviously, there was no dialysis in Westerbork, and that's where he died and was allowed to die. And instead of burying the dead, the Germans would not allow Jews to do that, which is supposed to be the custom from a religious point of view. The Jews had to be cremated. Their bodies had to be cremated. They were placed into special receptacles. You can call them urns or whatever you like. They were labeled. And after the war, hundreds of these urns were discovered of people who had died inside Westerbork, including both of my grandfathers. And the Red Cross had taken them over. When my uncle came to claim me, he found out about it, and he had their urns placed in a special part of the Demon Cemetery outside of Amsterdam, along with about 400 others. Normally that would be against Jewish religious law, but the rabbis said that they would allow it in this case because this was not of their own choosing. It's one thing if you choose your own cremation. It's another thing if other people do. Whether they were in fact their remains, we'll never know. And I don't know if I have it in my thing here. I may have it in here. I have a picture of the headstone, which is a really interesting headstone, also tells 1,000 words. So that's what happened. Okay, so that's an interesting story.
How did your grandmother die?
She was sent within a few months after he died. She was sent off to Sobibor and was murdered there too, in August 1943.
And what were their names?
Leopold Davids and Julie Davids.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One.
Please tell me about this document.
So although the Netherlands has long had a reputation of being a country of rescuers during World War II, which it was, no question about it, that's only half the story. At the same time, it was also a country of collaborators and perpetrators. It's complicated. This picture tells that other side of the story. After the Germans invaded the Netherlands, they began encouraging young Dutch men to join the SS in the Netherlands, and only Aryans could join the SS. Okay? And this turned out to be a very, very successful recruitment campaign. Posters like the one you see here were placed in town squares, store windows, and so on, to encourage young people to join. We know that approximately 23,000 joined. Most of them, though, did not remain in the Netherlands. Most of them were actually shipped out to the east. But the fact was that 23,000 joined. Now, to be fair and to make it a balanced thing, we have to remember that a lot of people joined the Nazi Party and the SS in the Netherlands, not necessarily because they had such great idealistic beliefs as the Nazi Germans did, but because they wanted to avail themselves of benefits, such as maybe better food, things like that. Okay, so it's not quite as simple as we want to make out. But on the other hand, you did have these collaborators, and many of them did have these Nazi beliefs. No question about that either. We know about that.
Thank you.
Some of them were tried after the war.
One.
Can you describe this picture for me?
Yes, and this picture I received relatively recently. I didn't know about this at all. This is the house where my mother and her brother and my grandparents lived. This is on my mother's side, my maternal, in the little town of Warburg. It's kind of a modernistic style. If you look carefully at the picture, you'll see that the house next door is a similar style. So the same architect, I guess, who designed it. I found out about this picture totally by accident. A man from Germany, an architect, emailed me this picture along with a very interesting story. His grandparents had once lived in this house. They discovered a bad history about this house, and they almost immediately got rid of it. And they told him about it later on in years, especially after he became an architect. And he was particularly interested in this house because today the house is also a National Historic Building. My parents had lived in this house until the mid-1930s. That was when the Nazi Germans came up with this plan of what they called Aryanization. In other words, whatever the Jews own is now going to be owned by Aryans, because after all, the Jews had stolen everything from the Aryans, and now they're getting their property back. In actual fact, they actually did repay the Jews, but only a fraction of what these properties were worth. They also took their businesses from them. My grandfather was a partner in the business with his father-in-law, and that business was confiscated as well. They were paid almost next to nothing for it. And so they were forced to move, to leave their business behind and to leave their house, and they were forced to move to another town in their 60s. That was when my mother and her brother needed to bring in income. It was almost impossible to find work in Germany, and both of them left to go and work for cousins in Amsterdam, which is why they left. Okay? But the two of them continued staying on in Germany for a while until Kristallnacht, when both of them left as well. But the house remained. And what happened was the house was given by the Nazis to some favorite of theirs, who paid a pittance for the house. And that house was then sold to someone else. That someone else were the grandparents of this man who had found out. How he got my email address and even my name, I don't know. He tried to explain it to me. It was a long, complicated story in German, which I never quite understood. But he was able to contact me. It was like half an invitation to come back to the village and perhaps reclaim the house, but I didn't want to touch that. To me, this was a contaminated house. I wasn't going to do that. I had actually planned to see the house in Germany a few years ago, but unfortunately I wasn't able to make the trip. So that's the history behind the house. It all has to do with Aryanization. That was one of the many methods that the Germans used to try and force the Jews out of Germany. They tried all kinds of other things, boycott their businesses. laws like the Nuremberg laws, which was like a kind of an apartheid type of set of laws where you had segregation between the Jews and the Aryans, and Jews no longer able to continue their professions. They couldn't renew their professional license and so on. Then that didn't work. Then they tried Aryanization. Then when that didn't work, they tried immigration. They tried to find places like Madagascar and Uganda for the Jews to stay. Then that didn't work. And then finally we had Kristallnacht. That worked.
Thank you. Please tell me about this document.
This document is a birth record. It's my birth record. It's not a birth certificate. My original birth certificate was destroyed by the Nazis. What happened was when the Germans invaded these different countries in Europe, and they started looking for Jewish communities, they wanted them to register, they wanted to make sure they were all in one place and keep their eye on them. They had different methods of doing that. And then what they would do is they would go into the registries of births and marriages to see whether those records indicated whether or not they were Jewish. If they didn't, they would add the names Israel for all males and Sarah for all females. Now, on a birth record, they include not only your name, but also the names of your parents. And therefore, you'll see by my name, they've added the name Israel. And by my mother's name, they've added the name Sarah. By my father's name, they've added the names Israel. I blackened out my actual middle name, and that was for security purposes. There's a long story behind that. We don't need to talk about that today. But that's what that was about. Now, what happened was, how did I end up finding the certificate? Well, in 1947, when my uncle came to claim me, my rescuing family refused to give me up, and he had to have a lawsuit for custody against them. In order to have any case at all, he had to prove who I was, who he was, how we were related, all kinds of things. The documents had to be obtained from somebody. The lawyer didn't know how to get them in time because my uncle was in a hurry to get back home. He had a pregnant wife, a young daughter, and a business being run by a total stranger. So what did the lawyer do here? He hired a private investigator to find these documents, including this. And he knew where to get it because he knew where the registry of births and so on was. So this is one of the documents that he got. And these documents, by the way, were all handed over to me in a dossier by my new father when I turned 21. And I had questions about them, and he said, "You just make them what you will. I want to discuss it with you." He never did. He just simply handed them to me. And what had happened was, when he found out about this during the course of the gathering of the documents, he was really mad. He got really upset. And he went over to the registrar against the advice of the lawyer, said, "You've got to change this. You have to take these names. You've got my brother's name there, including Israel. My sister-in-law is Israel, and my nephew's name is Israel. You need to remove those because those are not the names that his parents had clearly had planned to give, because the lawyer told him about the story about the Israel and the Sarah." And the registrar's office said to him, "Actually, sir, that's not the case. There were people who were sometimes given the names Sarah and Israel as other names, sometimes even as first names. And unless at least one of the parents is alive to testify that they had never intended to give them that name, and that the original birth certificate never had that name, we are forced to leave it." To this day, the Registrar of Births in Amsterdam has my name, including Israel. A picture tells 1,000 words.
Please tell me about this photograph.
So this is a photograph of the small town of Dokkum in northern Friesland, way up in the north of Europe. This is the town to where I'd been brought around Christmas time, 1943, at the age of 14 months, when I was deathly ill, and nobody wanted to take me. The Dutch resistance people locally eventually found somebody in a nearby village, the Bakker family, who eventually did take me. Initially, they didn't want to take me permanently either. They only wanted to take me for a brief time. But this is where I was brought. And this is an interesting town. It has a very interesting history. It's very old. It's also the one end of a very famous kind of skating event that they have every so often when there's enough ice on the canals. It's known as the Elfstedentocht, which means the 11 city tour. And everybody, young and old, makes that trip on skate. They haven't had it for quite a few years, probably because of global warming. There hasn't been thick enough ice for it.
Thank you. Can you please describe this document?
This document was issued by the Red Cross of the Netherlands, and it's a description. This particular one happens to be in German, and it describes, it's essentially a death certificate, which describes what happened to my father, and it contains information that was obtained from the records that were kept at Westerbork, the transit camp in the northeast of the Netherlands, to where most of the Jews of the Netherlands were sent prior to being sent off to death or labor camps. What it essentially says, it gives you my father's full name, his date and place of birth, the place from where he had been picked up before being brought to Westerbork, the date he arrived in Westerbork, the date he was shipped out of Westerbork, the transport number, and the name of the final destination camp. It also indicates in a stamped portion of the document on the lower left part, I believe, that the given date of death, what the given date of death was, which is April 2nd, 1943. They say that because in these gas chamber camps, nobody sat down there with a scorecard keeping records of who went in, who was killed in the gas chambers. They just didn't do that. They didn't need to. The only records that they really needed to keep were those people that could be or were being used for labor. That was when they kept records, because labor had to be charged out to the factories that employed them. Okay? So in this case, it's based on other factual evidence. For example, we know that there was a schedule for sending Jews from Westerbork through these various camps. Almost all of them involved trips that began on Tuesday, involved a trip of 3 nights, and you arrived in one of 2 camps, either the death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau or the death camp Sobibor, and you had arrived in one of those 2 camps late Friday afternoon or early evening. And based on that, and based on the fact that Sobibor was a small, efficient camp, we know that he almost certainly would have been murdered sometime on Friday, April the 2nd. There are similar documents from my mother, for the grandparents, for all the others who had, family members who had made the fatal mistake of moving to the Netherlands from Germany, which is most of my extended family. I found out, by the way, talking about that there were 76 members of my extended family living in Europe when I was born in the middle of the war in Europe. And of that 76, only 5 of us came out alive. Today, only 2 are alive. In addition to myself, I have a cousin who lives in Seattle, and I'm speaking now as of March the 18th, 2024.
Thank you. Please describe this photograph.
So this is a photograph of a headstone of several members of my family who were murdered during the Holocaust. It's located in a portion of a cemetery in the city of Diemen, just outside of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. The picture was taken sometime in 1947, at a time when my uncle, the one who would become my adoptive father later, was still in the Netherlands to claim me. He discovered what had happened at Westerbork, that his father had died in Westerbork, and what had happened to some other members of his family, including his mother, my parents, and my uncle and aunt. That meant his brother and sister-in-law. And he decided that he wanted to memorialize them all on the same headstone. There's a long story behind this. If anybody died in Westerbork that was Jewish, they were not allowed to be cremated. Not allowed to be, buried. They had to be cremated, even though that's against the Jewish religion. Their remains were supposedly put into containers like urns and labeled. And after the war, and after the camp was liberated by the Canadians, they discovered these urns. There were over 400 of them. Most of them were picked up by descendants and other survivors. My uncle found out about this, and the Red Cross arranged to let him have the container, and it was taken to Diemen and buried there. And before he left the Netherlands, he made sure that he had that headstone put up and took a photograph of it. He got somebody to take this picture for him. Not only does the stone show the name of his father, who was supposedly interned in that container, but it also includes the names of his mother, my grandmother, who was murdered in Sobibor. It includes the names of my uncle and aunt, the parents of the only other survivor, the one who lives in Seattle, who were murdered in Sobibor as well. And there is something missing from that stone. The name of his middle sister, Helena, who at that time was missing. No one knew what had happened to her. We only pieced together the full story about her about 5 years ago.
What
happened to her? What happened to her?
She married a man from Poland who was a widower with one child. The two of them were picked up by the Germans and sent to Auschwitz and murdered, all three of them, including the young child. But at that time, it wasn't sure whether she was alive or not, and so her name doesn't appear there. And the wording there is in Dutch. You didn't want to do that in German.
Please describe this photograph.
So this is a photograph of the Bakker family. That's the family who took me into open hiding during a portion of the war. Originally, they were not going to take me into hiding permanently. They only wanted to take me for 4 weeks. But while I was there during that period, they suddenly began to take a liking to me and decided to keep me on a permanent basis. The parents seated there in the front are Berend Bakker and his wife Jeltje. And you see 4 children gathered around them, plus a small one on the right corner, which happens to be myself. But the children from right to left, over on the far left, you have those 2 young people, Harem at the bottom, the son, the youngest daughter, Rick, above him. And then moving to the right, you'll see the eldest daughter, the tallest one, Hilda or Hiltje. And to her right, you'll see the middle daughter, whose name was Sitz or Sitzka.
How old were you when this photo was taken?
I was not quite 4 years of age at the time this picture was taken. It was taken after World War II. It ended in a portrait studio. And so the hair coloration and maybe even the complexion of these people is not really accurate because it was backlit. They all had pretty fair hair, and you don't see that in this picture because of the backlighting.
Did we talk about anything else in the other one? This is it? Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.